Guides for RPGs, whether they be official or fan-made, have come a long way since the 90s. RPG players in general have just become more neurotic over time, practically demanding every walkthrough be as thorough as humanly possible and delve into each and every tiny, obscure facet of the game for the sake of being informative. Especially in the case of retro RPGs, we now have had enough time to dump and data dive the game's files, and reverse engineer them all to see how everything works. Every hidden item, AI routine, and programming oversight is now laid bare for us. So, with all that in mind, it's insane how well this particular strategy guide holds up. I'm speaking of the Final Fantasy III Nintendo Player's Guide from 1994. Now, for those of you who may be a bit confused, the American Final Fantasy III is the original Final Fantasy VI. Back in the early days of the franchise, we skipped a lot of the games, so our FF3 was actually FF6. For simplicity's sake, I'll just be calling it FF6, since that's what most people know it as. This guide was one of the meatiest ever written for a single game at the time, and it kinda set the standard for what future RPG strategy guides would be like for years to come. The events of the game are all laid out in a very simple, clear order. Even in the game's second half, where it essentially becomes an open-world game, they're sure to cover each area in an order that minimizes backtracking and allows them to cover everything you need to know about each location all at once. It gives character recommendations where they feel it's most helpful, but they also don't feel the need to completely dictate the player's party at every turn, which is something you would absolutely see in most modern fan-made walkthroughs. In fact, the guide doesn't ever completely hold your hand on much of anything. It tells you what you need to do and where to go to progress the story, and that's basically it. No beating around the bush, no treating you like an idiot. It features full area maps that point out items, story events, and other points of interest, as well as lists of what's available in each of the game's shops. Final Fantasy VI has certain treasure chests that change their contents after a certain point in the story, and the book makes sure to point those instances out to you as well. It has glossaries at the end that list all of the game's available spells, items, equipment, and espers, as well as two separate lists of enemies, one that lists each monster's HP, weaknesses, and which items you can obtain or steal from them, and another that lists which abilities your party members will use with that monster's sketch or rage. It also covers the game's Colosseum, telling you which items will be exchanged for which, and what enemy you'll have to fight to win them. Little hints and tips pages are also scattered throughout the book, with some offering pretty advanced gameplay advice like lesser-known relic effects, pointing out the quirks of the secret imp set of equipment, and even calculating the damage formula of Setzer's dice weapons. The book splits the walkthrough into the same two halves as the game itself, the World of Balance and the World of Ruin, with the former half's pages having red borders with blue text, and the reverse for the latter half, which makes it easy to quickly tell which section of the walkthrough you're in when you're just flipping through pages. Moreover, it separates each half of the game further into numbered events, and the final dungeon's pages are printed on black backgrounds. You should never have trouble flipping straight to the section you need with all these clever visual cues. It's all pretty great stuff. But all that being said, there are a few things I could point out that I'm maybe not the biggest fan of here. The first is really more of a nitpick, and it's something I've noticed about Nintendo-published guides in general, so it's not specific to this one, but it sorts all the maps and shop lists for each location all at once and at the earliest possible point, which may sound fine, but the thing about a lot of RPGs is that they have you returning to certain locations several times, and not everything is going to be explored on your first visit. For instance, the beginning of FF6 sees a short prologue in the town of Narshe, and you visit maybe 4 or 5 screens in total on that first visit, and none of the shops are accessible either. But the guide lists all of that information right off the bat, whether it's relevant to your current objective or not, and anytime the game has you return to that location, you have to flip back to those initial pages if you want to see the map or shop lists again. I don't think it's unreasonable to prefer that they keep the World of Balance and World of Ruin shop lists relegated to those halves of the game, instead of listing them together at the first opportunity. I like that the information is all here, I just think it could have been formatted in a way that doesn't require the player to flip through half the book to see it when they actually need it. Like, if I'm not going to explore these caves until hours later, why are you showing them to me now? It's also missing quite a bit of info that would be considered must-haves in most any RPG guide or walkthrough these days. I couldn't help but notice that it makes no mention of a late-game side quest that ties up Gao's story arc. Granted, said side quest lasts about 10 minutes, it's just a series of cutscenes, and it gives no in-game rewards, but it still seems weird not to even point it out. They point out other extraneous story events in the book, like Shadow's dream sequences, so I have to assume this was just a complete oversight. More notably, though, is that it also doesn't list any enemy locations, and that's actually pretty important to know in FF6. One party member's skill set is almost entirely determined by which enemies you've encountered, and you also need to find certain enemies to learn Strago's lore spells. And given the nature of the game, there are a lot of enemies that are completely missable once you pass certain points in the story. Every enemy is listed in the aforementioned glossaries, but nowhere does it tell you where or when those enemies can actually be encountered. To be fair, this sort of information was not nearly as important in past Final Fantasies, or even past RPGs in general, but in FF6 it actually matters quite a bit. I'd go so far as to say it's comparable to writing a Pokemon guide that doesn't specify Pokemon locations. Like, what's even the point then, right? The guide is also a bit lacking when it comes to boss strategies, or strategies in general. Most boss battles are summed up in less than a paragraph, and unless the boss revolves around a particularly notable gimmick, the strategies normally boil down to little more than hit them a bunch and heal when you need to. Look, I'm all for figuring out a game on your own, but if I'm buying a guide, try and give me something to chew on when it comes to strategizing. Thankfully though, unlike the first guide I covered on this channel, this one absolutely does make for a really neat collector's item. This book was the first time Americans at large were introduced to the artwork of Yoshitaka Amano, being showcased in various spots throughout its pages, and with little character bios right at the beginning. Prior Final Fantasy games released in the West, those being 1 and 4, received reimagined Americanized artwork that was often a far cry from the original concepts. But this was the first time Nintendo of America really embraced the Japanese artwork. And that's great because Amano's art truly is one of a kind. Overall, this guide is really something to behold. Modern RPG fans are likely going to find it kinda lacking, especially if they're the type to incessantly pursue perfect save files and are determined to find every hidden secret and missable item, but this guide wasn't really made for that. For casual runs of this game, it still holds up remarkably well in getting the player through the game with informative yet concise instructions. I doubt you'll ever find yourself wondering what you should be doing if you have this book, and it was still thorough and informative enough to set the bar for future RPG strategy guides to come. Now, it's worth noting that the guide doesn't include any greater world map, only individual location maps, but you also have to remember that the US release of FF6 originally came with maps of the overworlds packed right into the box. And besides, that's kind of a moot point nowadays, with those maps only a simple Google search away. Unfortunately for casual fans, this guide has risen up to triple-digit prices on the aftermarket in recent years, so it's really only going to be worth hunting down for collectors and superfans. But hey, that's true of most strategy guides anyway. All in all, thumbs up from me.